has worked in local government before becoming the Director of Research at the City's Research Centre in Bristol in the UK. She joined Melbourne University in 2011 and before that she had been on the University of Birmingham's first policy commission. She's also been involved in producing some publications about the future of local public services and the report, the Policy Commission's report, When Tomorrow Comes. So someone who has had a lot of experience in local public services and implications for local government in both Britain and Australia. Could you please welcome Professor Helen Sullivan.
Well, thank you all for staying, and I think it's very adventurous of the organisers of this conference to put an academic on at this time in the afternoon, but let's see how we go. Thank you very much for that generous introduction. I always love speaking to people from local government, whether it's in the UK or here in Australia. I know the two are very different. And one of the things I'm going to be talking to you about today is the piece of work that John mentioned, When Tomorrow Comes, the report of the Policy Commission. And you may think that that has got very little to do with you, but if that's the case, I'd just like to start by asking you a couple of questions. Who in this room thinks that over the next 5 years they'll be doing a lot more with a lot less? Who in this room thinks that they are in complete control of what happens to local government in the next 5 years? Oh, we've got one. And who in this room thinks that local government is a values-driven organisation? Okay, all right. Well, we might have something to talk about at the end then. Okay, so this is a slide which some of you may have seen. It was incredibly popular in the UK for a while. This is Birmingham City Council, which was once the biggest council this side of the, or that side it would be then, of the Ural Mountains. And this was a slide that was put together to highlight what was happening. This is a couple of years ago now. Highlight what was happening with local government budgets and with expectations of service spend. And this slide became known as the Jaws of Doom, because what you see is the gap between the level of service that is expected to be provided and the level of resource that will be made available to the council. So for those of you thinking about doing more with less, this is a really good case of what happens. And I know that you've got Barry Quirk speaking to you later on this afternoon, and I'm sure he'll be able to tell you a little bit more about how local government in the UK is having to think about doing even more with almost nothing. So that really was a starter for us to think at the University of Birmingham, what should we be doing as people who are actively interested in local government, local public services, as academics who research, teach, but also are engaged in public services in different ways. What are the ways in which we might be starting to think about how you respond to this extraordinary change? And so we established the first policy commission. The university has subsequently run a number, but the first one was all about the future of local public services. And we brought together a range of people who'd had long experience in the public, private, not-for-profit sectors. And we were also advised by a group of young people who had the label that they wore, because it was what was given to them, a group of young people who had what we would describe as complex needs. They were homeless, they were jobless, they came from very different family backgrounds, and they agreed to work with us as advisors to this project. And the report that we produced in 2011, When Tomorrow Comes, is something that they had a very clear hand in. And I know that this conference has been talking quite a bit about digital activity and the role of social media, and I can absolutely confirm that as far as they were concerned, if public services were to be delivered more appropriately, more effectively, and more responsively, that local government and others needed to get their act together around digital delivery. So what we started with was a question about what do we think public services are all about? If we had a blank sheet of paper, recognising that we don't, but if we did, and we knew that the circumstances we were facing were such that there was relatively little resource going into traditional institutions. How might we think about a system of local public services? And the group of commissioners, now I wasn't a commissioner, I was the person who was managing the process and offering support and doing the research and all of those kinds of things. The commissioners came up with this idea for what they called a system of local public support, where they talk about that being all available resources from whatever source that are coordinated to offer helpful acts of various kinds, and those too are not just traditional services, but all sorts of things to promote individual and community well-being. Now, you may well say that's terribly vague and terribly general, but actually it's pretty specific, because what it does is it points to the fact that no single institution can contribute to well-being alone, that we all, as citizens, as well as professionals, elected politicians, whoever, have ways in which we can contribute to our own well-being. And well-being is not just all about service delivery, it's about a whole range of other things. And they were really clear that this was an important definition for them around which to build a set of core features for what they called a local public service framework. Now, I'm not going to go through these in any detail. If people are interested, the report's still on the website, or we have some hard copies still left, although not many, but it is available on the website. But really what I wanted to do with this was to emphasize a couple of things. None of these priorities or these features are any more important than any others. They are all important. But this group of commissioners were absolutely clear that what had to happen in a system of public service support was that the interaction between the political process and the service delivery process had to be maintained. So this was not about, for them, diminishing the idea of local government as a democratic institution. It was about extending and enhancing that through its engagement with others. And that was vitally important, because one of the things that they were very concerned about being accused of was taking the politics out of local government. And I know there are lots of people who would love to take the politics out of local government, but what they meant by that was that one of the values of local government for them was its democratic basis, and that had to be retained, and indeed this was an opportunity to extend that into other institutions. So 10 core features, but that was the thing that kept coming up in relation to how do we think about how decisions are made, who gets to make them, and what the interactions are. And then they came up with what they called 4 conditions for success. And again, some of these should be very familiar to you. And I know my conversations with people in Australia, we've been talking about a range of these things in slightly different ways. And this is essentially about citizens taking, if you like, more responsibility for themselves, or on the other hand, you could describe it as citizens being allowed to do some of the things that they know they can do for themselves without institutions getting in the way. 21st century public servants, this is something that we've done a lot of work on both in the UK but also here in Australia since I've been running the School of Government. And we did some work last year that we published called Towards a 21st Century Public Service Workforce. I've brought some copies if people are interested, where we've been building on some of the ideas that came out of this work and came out of subsequent rounds of work that have been done following on from the Policy Commission. And we also talked about local government as being the linchpin of this system of local public service support, connected and connective. I'll say a little bit more about in a moment. And the last one is a new national community settlement. As you know, or you may, I'm sure you do know, local government in the UK exists by virtue of the grace of central government. And so the same kinds of things that can happen here to local government can happen there and have indeed happened there. And so there was a call here for really rethinking that kind of relationship. Now, what does all of this mean for local government? This is what I've been asked to talk about, and I'm conscious of time, and I know that you have tea, and I will be here for tea if people have specific questions. But just to focus for the last few minutes on what does this mean for local government? There are 2 things that keep coming up. They come up in slightly different ways, but there are 2 things that keep coming up in the sort of recent history of local government. One is this concept of enabling, and more recently this idea of stewardship. And the commissioners thought both of these were incredibly important, but that certainly enabling is a term that has multiple meanings. And if you're a particular kind of local politician. The idea of enabling is that it's all about reducing the size of the state. It's about other people doing things for themselves and making the state smaller, whether that's local government, whether it's regional government, whatever it is. And what your job is here is to think about encouraging and facilitating other organisations to doing things, or citizens doing things for themselves. But there's another version of enabling which talks much more about local government being the leader and empowering its communities to be more informed, to be more influential, to be more directive in how resources in that locality are determined and spent. Now, that may mean that there are some elements of reducing the size of the state, but it gives local government a rather different role, other than a sort of residual role that you can see in relation to the first definition. This is very much about community government, community leadership being about local government taking the lead, taking responsibility. And thirdly, enabling has also been discussed as being the arena for political conflict, the space where those difficult conversations about whether you should fund X rather than Y need to take place, and they need to take place with interested parties, with other organisations, with communities. So there are a range of ways of thinking about enabling, and there's no particular prescription from me about which one, but I think it's certainly important to be clear that if you are thinking about enabling as a way of working out what the future of local government is, and you may not be, but if you are, then I think it's very important to be clear about that. And the other term that's used, and now used much more frequently, probably more than enabling, is the concept of stewardship. And this is really, I think, very interesting in that what it does do is it speaks quite clearly to the idea of local government as a values-based institution, and that local government's responsibility goes beyond just what it delivers itself, but is also about securing well-being in the wider community, even if that means that you are interacting with, interfering in, and sticking your neck out over a range of issues. Now, I would imagine that most local governments think that's their business as a matter of course, but again, it is something to think about. What are the values that underpin that, and are you clear about what they are in your organisation? And it's also interesting because it is a term, stewardship, that implies not just the now, but implies future. It implies that local government as an institution is something that has a future. And that was one of the things that the policy commissioners were very clear about, that some system of local public service support, whatever it was, had to be something that could be sustained into the future and was not something that was just about responding to a particular budget crisis. Now, this slide comes from some other work that I've done in other places, in other spaces, but it picks up, I think, a little bit on some of the themes that were raised in the previous session. And again, it's not prescriptive, it's not trying to make you choose between one kind of thing or another, but it does seem to me that when we're thinking about the future and how we try to understand what the future is going to look like and what our role is in it, there are some helpful ways of just considering what we might be prioritising in at what point in time. And there are two things for me that have been really helpful. The first is an idea that comes from a particular line of political theory which distinguishes between strong politics and thin politics. And thin politics, if you like, is the representative system. It's the system that most liberal democracies have, and it is about focusing decision-making and responsibility in the hands of people who are elected. Strong politics, on the other hand, is politics that's much more plural, that requires much more active engagement with communities and citizens and sees them as participants in the process. So two quite different things. They're not contrary, they can exist together, although it can be uncomfortable for people when they do. But it is important to think about the ways in which different decisions that you might make might require either a thin politics or a strong politics, or you may decide that you would want to be pursuing one kind of politics over another, but your communities may have very different ideas about that. And the other axis comes from a a Belgian philosopher called Anne-Marie Moll, who has done an awful lot of work in public services, and public services are interesting spaces for philosophers to work in, as you might imagine. And she distinguishes between what she calls a logic of care and a logic of choice. And again, these two things are not necessarily contradictory, although you may choose one over the other. But it's really about drawing that distinction that we all live with all the time, about the moment in service delivery when we are customers, consumers, and the moment where actually what we are is patients or clients, and the different relationships we might have with professionals and with politicians in those different cases. So it's about reminding us that as citizens, we all have different relationships with public services, we all have different identities, we all have multiple identities. And the job, I think, for people thinking about the future of local government and where they sit is really trying to figure out in what circumstances do different kinds of relationships pertain. Because I think the only mistake that can be made is assuming that there's only one kind of relationship and that has to fit everything. And then just to finish, I think one of the things that was most powerful for us coming out of the Commission was this idea of connected and connective local government. And I think this is where the questions about the digital age come in and the ways in which local government could be at the forefront of some of the activities around the use of digital media and other things. And it's really about people differentiating between where they want local government to be connected to them, into local communities, clearly into the views of users, understanding the potential of new markets and the role of local government possibly making new markets, but also engaging directly with users and providers. So being connected very clearly and very deeply into the community and into the range of stakeholders, if you want to use that language, but also acting itself as a connector. Being able to connect people to other sources of support, being able to hold people to account, being able to coordinate resources more effectively, and I know a range of you in this room do that very well. And also, this was an interesting phrase that kept coming up, rather than well-being, people were talking much more about social solidarity and local government as being an institution for maintaining this idea of the social. Now, in terms of new roles, what this meant, and as I say, we've done more work on this and we've fleshed these out rather a lot more, but it did seem to us that there were some new and old roles that people were associating with the future of local government, whether you were politicians or professionals, and that was really about a re-emphasis on people being able to tell stories, of narrating what the future might look like in a compelling way, of being able to construct in a fairly precise way, an architecture for the future that was flexible but robust, that required people who could weave together different patterns of resources. And that's one of those things that sounds simple until you try to find somebody who can do it, and then you realize just how precious these people are. And then people who can navigate, people who are able to join things up, to work across boundaries, and to bring people together in ways that generate new ideas and new opportunities. Now, we're not saying that some of the old roles aren't important. Absolutely they are. But these are really just things that, for us, seem to be the new areas where local government and others should be developing their activities. So I think I've probably said enough, and I think we probably have time for a question or two. But as I say, I'm around for tea, so if people do want to talk about any of this, I'm more than happy to. Thank you.